There are people who say, what right have women to talk to men about fighting for their country, since women are not, according to the custom of civilization, called upon to fight? That used to be said to us in times of peace. Certainly, women have the right to say to men, are you going to fight to defend your country and redeem your promise to women? The least that men can do is that every man of fighting age should prepare himself to redeem his word to women, and to make ready to do his best to save the mothers, the wives, and the daughters of Great Britain from outrage too horrible even to think of. What bitterness there was in the hearts of many women when they saw work and business going on as usual, carried on by men who ought to be in the fighting line, who ought to be in the fighting line, who ought to be in the fighting line.
As November 11th approached, I felt compelled to put together a video on the First World War. The focus shall not be the war itself as such, but the question of suffrage. Emmeline Pankhurst, whose words you will have heard at the beginning of this video, was the leader of the British suffragette movement, the sole aim of which was ensuring that women be granted the right to vote, a just end to which any and all means were permissible. The common, popular conception of history is that women did not have the right to vote at the time of the First World War, and that men, conversely, did. That it was women who fought tooth and nail for the inalienable right that they and they alone were denied. This could not be further from the truth. Let us return to Miss Pankhurst. What I found most troubling about her words, taken from a speech she gave fewer than 9 months after Great Britain had entered the war, was its complete disregard for male life in relation to female life.
The least that men can do is that every man of fighting age should prepare himself to redeem his word to women, and to make ready to do his best to save the mothers, the wives, and the daughters of Great Britain from outrage too horrible even to think of.
Other than its expectation that men should sacrifice themselves for women as a matter of course, what baffles me is that she considered the detrimental effect that German victory would have upon women's rights in Europe a misguided belief, to be an outrage too horrible even to think of. The thought of men, young and old, wallowing in squalid trenches, deprived of food, water, medicine, being slaughtered in their thousands, dismembered, bleeding out, trench fever, trench foot, shell shock, forced to murder their fellow man on the whims of politicians, burying their best friends, their brothers in arms, and on the horror goes. That thought, it would seem, was quite palatable to her. If this seems like an exaggeration on my part, consider another line from her 1915 speech.
If the unthinkable thing happened, and Germany were to win, the women's movement, as we know it in Europe, would be put back 50 years at least.
That is her concern? Not the men, not the husbands, the fathers, the brothers, and the sons? Not the balance of political and economic power in Europe? No. Her concern is that the women's movement might, for some reason, be put back 50 years. I cite this quote, for Emmeline Pankhurst claimed that the suffragettes would suspend their campaign for the duration of the war. They demonstrably did no such thing. Let us, then, delve into the question of what contribution these suffragettes, these feminists, made to the war effort. In August 1914, at the start of the First World War, Admiral Charles Fitzgerald founded the Order of the White Feather, with support from the prominent author Mrs. Humphrey Ward. The organisation aimed to shame men into enlisting in the British Army by persuading women to present them with a white feather if they were not wearing a uniform. Conscription was yet to be introduced in Britain, requiring the assembly of a voluntary army to bolster the standing ranks. The former were joined by prominent suffragettes of the time, such as Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel. They spoke at public rallies in support of the movement, handing out feathers to civilian men and encouraging other women to do likewise. The ignominy of receiving a white feather, a symbol of cowardice in British culture, led an incalculable number of men to volunteer. The suffragettes and the government, bitter enemies a few months prior, had become means to each other's ends. This is the responsibility, chiefly, of the state, but I refuse to dismiss the role played by women, specifically suffragettes, in attempting to destroy men's self-worth and forcing them to face the atrocities of war as recompense.
What is it?
A white feather, of course, coward.
Unsurprisingly, it was not uncommon for white feathers to be handed to soldiers home on leave. One such individual was Private Ernest Atkins. He was riding a tram one day when a white feather was presented to him by a girl sitting a row back. He smacked her across the face with his paybook and said, "Certainly I'll take your feather back to the boys at Passchendaele. I'm in civvies because people think my uniform might be lousy, but if I had it on, I wouldn't be half as lousy as you." Seaman George Sampson, who had been awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry in the Gallipoli campaign, was en route to a public reception in his honour, dressed in civilian clothes, when a young woman stopped him to present him with a white feather. One could be forgiven for thinking that these women were almost eager to hand men white feathers. Well, Compton Mackenzie, then a serving soldier, complained about the activities of the Order of the White Feather, arguing that these idiotic young women were using white feathers to get rid of boyfriends of whom they were tired. There was, I'm afraid to say, an even darker side to the white feather campaign. Approximately 250,000 boys under the age of 19, the legal limit for armed service, volunteered to fight. There were no birth certificates, and I should imagine the state was not quick to question eager young men. This young boy, presumed to be the young brother of Bombardier George Herbert Bill, was given a white feather brooch at age 10 or 11, with a note that read, "What a promising boy you were. Now wear this brooch and buttons and your frilly white dress. Whilst your brother goes to war, riding gallantly, the town all sees your ways. Chicken you are." 3 boys aged 18, 17 and 15 all committed suicide after being given white feathers. The following reaction from a Lieutenant J.L. Perry may well mirror what some of you are currently feeling. The Australian veteran had lost an eye while fighting in Syria. When handed a white feather by a woman in the street, Perry said nothing. He merely dropped the glass eye from its socket and into her hand. Interestingly, Army authorities said Perry would have been justified in having the woman charged with offensive behaviour.
What is it?
A white feather, of course, coward.
Stop this at once. This is neither the time nor the place.
These people should be aware that there are cowards among them.
Will you please leave? You are the cowards here, not they.
How times have changed. As the first half of the war came to a close, the subject turned to that of conscription and universal suffrage.
The white feather girls and the suffragettes understood that men had political franchise and women did not, because men had a duty to go to war to protect women. I find it kind of odd how the suffragettes seem to have forgotten that men and men alone had been burdened with this obligation to protect their womenfolk and to act as cannon fodder in the interests of their governments according to their individual wills or against it, long before universal male suffrage was a twinkle in anyone's eye.
While the dates and details differ from nation to nation, there was a clear historical trend. Suffrage, the right to vote, was granted to the wider population in drips and drabs over a period of centuries. Some context, if I may. In the year 1432, King Henry VI decreed that only male owners of property worth at least 40 shillings, a significant sum, were entitled to vote. This remained the case until the introduction of the so-called Great Reform Act of 1832. This extended the right to vote to approximately 1 in 7 men, subject to the value of their propertied land. Further reforms in 1867 and 1884 increased the percentage of males eligible to vote to around 60% of the population aged 21 and over. Women were yet to be extended suffrage. And thus we reach the First World War. If one allows for the number of British soldiers under the age of 21 and the disproportionate number of recruits from the lower and middle classes, it would be quite reasonable to assert that more than half of the men fighting for Britain during World War I did not have the right to vote. I repeat, the majority of men who fought for Britain during the First World War did not have the right to vote. Let us then reconsider the context of the White Feather Campaign. Women, many of whom would no doubt have been suffragettes, or at the very least supportive of women being given the right to vote, will have shamed men and boys who did not have the right to vote into risking their health, their sanity, their lives. What words are there to describe such actions? In January 1916, a military service bill was introduced rendering all men aged 18 to 41 liable to be called up for service, the first instance of legislated military conscription in British history. Similar acts introducing conscription were passed elsewhere in the Anglosphere. None of these bills placed any obligation upon women to contribute. Now, whether you agree or disagree with this, and I know there are many out there who feel that it is the duty of men and men alone to serve in the armed forces, it does rather discredit the feminist supposition that men are the privileged sex and have been throughout history. It would seem that the obligation to fight a war for a country that does not permit you to vote is a man's privilege. The right to be mocked, shamed, humiliated, and scorned by female strangers for being male is a man's privilege. The horror of war is a man's privilege? When the First World War ended, another Reform Act was passed extending suffrage to every man over the age of 21, as well as most women over the age of 30. The discrepancy in age was to account for the greater percentage of women in the electorate as a result of significant male casualties during the war. Before I end this video, I would like to take a moment to remember my great-grandfather, James William Pedrick, who fought during the First World War at a very young age. Here we see both his medical card and the two medals he was issued at the war's end, the British War Medal and the Allied Victory Medal. Whatever one may think of the motives behind the war itself and the disastrous Treaty of Versailles, the ordinary men and women who were drawn into the war will always be deserving of our respect and sympathies. I encourage everyone with a relative who fought during the war to share their story in the comment section below. I would very much like to hear from you. I leave you then with the bittersweet image of an English poppy field in full bloom.